Um, Thanks, Vic, for the introduction, and Tony for all the usual administrative behind-the-scenes work that you do for these sessions and for the Everyman Bible class. I want to thank the class for inviting me out yet again. I sure do appreciate the relationship that we've established over the years, and always look forward to being with all of you. Thanks also to Mr. and Mrs. Cap Roberts for their support of what's now called the Roberts Teaching Fund. I understand that makes Christian adult education possible here at First Presbyterian. And thanks all of you for being here today. The purpose of me getting up here and talking is not so that I put on a suit and get up and talk. The purpose is for you to learn something. So if there's at any point in this lesson where you have a question, you have a thought, you have a reflection, please put up your hand and fire away. I mean, I hope I have a train of thought, but if I do, your questions won't interrupt my train of thought. So you're the reason why I'm here, and your learning is the primary objective here. So if you have questions at any point, just please don't be shy, raise your hand. The subject of these sessions is, of course, the work of Rene Girard. I don't expect many people in this room to have heard of that person prior to last time or today, if this is your first time. I don't expect many of my students at the seminary to have heard of him when they walk into the classroom and we talk about him for the first time. But he is on his way to being considered one of the most important theological figures of the 20th century, certainly the latter half of the 20th century. So he has become an essential person, an essential read in seminary education. And I hope that these sessions, introduce you to some important ideas. Girard is not Moses come down from Sinai. He's just a guy trying to figure things out as best he can, like the rest of us. So this is not gospel. This is a theory. These are ideas that he's been kicking around. So you should receive them as such. And with any kind of theory or new idea that comes along, we should think critically about it. We should ask hard questions about it, and we shouldn't immediately take it in to our intellectual frame or theological frameworks, but we want to subject it to the scrutiny it deserves. So just because I'm up here and because I teach at a seminary and I told you this guy is one of the most important thinkers of the 20th century, doesn't mean you have to agree with him by any means. But let's just give him a spin and see what he may have to offer us. He's an interesting figure to me because he continues the great tradition of theologians who come into Christian theology kicking and screaming. They're dragged into this subject matter against their will. And this starts with the very first Christian theologian, the Apostle Paul, who really wanted to have nothing to do with this new Jewish Christian movement that was starting up. He saw it as a threat to traditional Judaism, Orthodox Judaism as he understood it. So he was resistant to the church and to this thing called the gospel. And he found himself inadvertently becoming the founder of Christian theology. Ironically, it just shows God works truly in mysterious ways, and that cliche is really true. In the 4th century, St. Augustine resisted the Christian faith of his mother. He went on a rock star party tour all throughout the Mediterranean world and eventually found his way back into the Christian faith and became probably one of the most influential Christian theologians of the Western world, anyway. So Girard fits that model. I don't know about his partying habits. I don't know whether he can compete with St. Augustine in that regard. My guess is really no one except for Mick Jagger could compete with St. Augustine in that respect. But Girard entered Christian theology through the back door, and we talked about that last time. Right? He studied He's a medieval studies student in France, immigrates to, of all places, the heart of the American Midwest, Indiana, gets a PhD in history at the University of Indiana. The university asks him to stay on and teach some courses, not in history, but in European literature. And again, we said this might have something to do with his accent, his thick French accent. He impressed the farm boys home from World War II and the GI Bill with his knowledge of the masters of European literature. And in the course of that, stumbled onto a theory about human desire. And we'll just review that briefly in a minute. From there, he started studying ancient religious mythology. And from there, he found his way into Christian theology. He found himself in a place that he thought he had left behind long ago. Like many great intellectuals of the 20th century, the trend is, Christianity is in the dustbin of history. I mean, there are people who still practice it, still people who show up to church, but they are passé. They are doing something that the world has outgrown. And so for a time, Girard found himself, identified with that. Christianity is interesting as, a source of ideas, part of the heritage of Western culture, but as a current viable intellectual option, he certainly had his doubts. When he comes back to study the New Testament, he is amazed at what he discovers, and it rekindles his Catholic faith, and he returns to the Roman Catholic Church, interestingly, as a result of his work. And so we'll talk a bit about why that was and what's to come. So quickly, just a snapshot review of some of his big ideas. The moral philosopher Isaiah Berlin said that there were two kinds of intellectuals in the world. And he used the animal symbols of the hedgehog and the fox to categorize two different kinds of intellectuals. The fox is nimble, it's darting around, it's getting its nose and paws into different places, it's very eclectic. The fox is looking at a lot of different things at once. It doesn't stay on one thing too long. There's that kind of intellectual, said Berlin. And then the other kind of intellectual he called the hedgehog. The hedgehog doesn't move too quickly. It's not very nimble. It focuses on one thing and stays with it throughout its whole life. And that's an academic like that usually comes up with one big idea and never abandons that idea and champions it all the way through to the end. Girard was not a fox, he is a hedgehog. He has one big idea and he sticks with it throughout his career. And that big idea is this thing he calls mimesis. Mimesis, we talked a little bit about that last time. But it's the belief that none of us are original, none of us are unique. What we think, how we feel, how we act is largely imitative. We look around the room, we look at what other people are doing, we examine how other people are thinking and feeling, and we take what they're thinking and feeling, what they're doing, and we adopt it for ourselves. What other people think is what we think. How other people are feeling is how we feel. And he said that it works like this because we're uncertain. We're fundamentally uncertain as to what we should be doing and how we should be processing reality. And in the face of that anxiety, we're looking for other people to signal to us what we should be doing, how we should be feeling. And mimesis is when someone's internal world, their thoughts, their psychological disposition, it starts to replicate and spread like a contagion throughout a community. So what's going on in someone's head, it starts going on in their neighbor's head, it comes into my head, and we start transmitting it around the community, such that we get to a point where we all start thinking similar things. We groupthink, I guess is what the term for it today is. This is good and this is bad. It's not necessarily terrible that we're not all original, because if we have a good model to imitate, that can be a good thing. We take on positive traits of other people. Someone has a particularly healthy psychological disposition, we can adopt that and make it our own. But it becomes a bad thing when we get someone who's pathological, dysfunctional, someone who's violent, and we will start to feed off their energy. Their mindset becomes our mindset. And this is where human community for Girard can quickly go wrong, when we start imitating the wrong person, we start adopting the wrong ideas. And once the momentum gets going, things can snowball and communities can quickly spiral out of control if the wrong ideas start to get into circulation. Another aspect of his thought is this thing he called mimetic desire. People in a community start to desire the same thing. And we start to desire the same thing again because our minds are contagious. We infect one another with our desires. So everyone eventually in a community, Girard says, starts wanting the same thing. And that same thing is in short supply. It's a limited resource. And he thought that a community would eventually start to go to war with one another over the limited resource that we've all learned to want. And he said, when this happens, boy, a community is in trouble, because a community will quickly turn on one another, start fighting with one another, and it presents a situation that's not stable in the long term. There's got to be a way to address mimetic rivalry when it takes place in a community. His work gets further interesting and strange and weird, depending on how you're receiving this, is when he starts to investigate ancient religious myths. He found something, again, this is a review from last time, something that was common to a lot of ancient religious myths, and that was they are centered in stories of sacrifice. Someone or something has to come to an end in the story, in a community's religious story, in order for the community to continue to move on. And he found that this was fascinating from a comparative religious standpoint. Why are all these different cultures, separated by huge oceans, coming up with similar ideas about the importance of sacrifice? And they're inscribing it in their essential foundational religious texts. So there is something going on here. And he came up with a theory as to why the theme of sacrifice comes up again and again, whether you're the Aztecs or the Irish or the ancient Irish or the Vikings or tribes in Asia, wherever. Why this common theme of sacrifice? Everywhere I look, asked Girard. And he came up with a theory. And that theory is that any human community is founded on what he called the founding murder. There are bodies buried beneath any kind of human institution or community that exists. And in the ancient world, we're talking about literal bodies. Someone was literally murdered. And why was someone murdered? Well, in his theory, it's because of mimetic rivalry. We start to go to war with one another because we all want the same thing. It builds up resentment, hostility, antagonism, aggression. There's anxiety, there's agitation, and the community all starts feeling like this because we borrow the the mindsets of other people. And eventually the situation gets so severe that we're about ready to kill one another. But then we realize a better way, quote unquote, better way. We take all our hostility, our aggression, our resentment, and we decide to dump it on one particular person to discharge, to get rid of all that negative emotion that's pulsating through us. And so one person is literally sacrificed for the good of the community. They take all the wrath of the community onto themselves, and this is it's like a release. The community, once all their negative energy is discharged onto a particular person, the community breathes a sigh of relief. That negative energy is gone, and now we can continue forward as a community. We no longer hate one another. We find that we are now reconciled to and with one another because we got rid of all this junk that was in us. And we dumped it on one person. And who is the best person, the best kind of person to get dumped on? Well, for Gerard, it was a person who was not powerful, not strong. Why? Well, you don't want to pick on someone who's strong because they're going to punch you right back in the face if you start messing with them. So the best kind of candidate for a scapegoat is someone who is weak, probably someone who has a physical ailment or disability, a challenge. Maybe someone whose IQ level is not as high as the rest of us. Someone who looks different and acts different. I can imagine, in prehistoric times, someone who's suffering from autism, someone who would stand out, and the community identifies that person as a great scapegoat. Because that person doesn't have a lot of friends, does not have an allies, cannot rally troops to their support. They are easily isolated. And so that kind of person is a perfect scapegoat for a community to reconcile and heal itself. And then Gerard says something interesting happens after that person may be literally murdered, or later, maybe less severely, they are cast outside the city gates, they are sent into exile, they are outcast from the community. That'd be a less severe form of scapegoating. But in the ancient world, boy, if you were outside the city gates on your own, you were not going to last very long. Gerard believes that the community knows in the back of its mind that it has done something wrong. The community in the back of its mind feels guilty. They know that they did this person wrong. But religion comes in, Gerard says, to absolve the community of its guilt. This is a very interesting theory of religion that people are still working through. Religion comes in to re-describe the scapegoating event that had just taken place. If you were there at the time that it happened, you would say, if you could see clearly and you were not afraid to tell the truth, you said, they did that person wrong. That person was innocent, and they dumped all their stuff onto him. And he was an unjust victim. That was not fair what they did to him. But religion said, no. It was right. It was fair. And they redescribe the story using mythological elements. So a priest, a pastor, whoever the ancient religious shaman in the community, no, that person looked like a human being, but he was really an evil spirit. And he was sent here to disrupt the community. And we did the right thing by taking that person out, because we removed the evil demonic spirit from our presence. And look what happened when we did. Our community functioned a lot better. Everything that we were fighting about went away. So he must have been the cause of what was ailing us. What was causing us to break into dissension. He's gone, and now we're better. Yes, sir.
So are you saying that in all people, A sense of conscience and right, wrong is innate. Get close to D.
Oh.
Yeah.
Well, sure, if people in the community feel guilty about it, and I think they should, then maybe that points to some kind of moral conscience that, that's in place in
But not
police
universal,
people.
because the priest said no.
Well, the priest is there to put the conscience on the back burner in the interest of the community. Now, when I say priest, I mean, I'm just talking about a religious person, a religious leader, someone who tells the stories to the community about religious matters, I guess. So let's just quickly take a look at an example of this. This is an example that Girard himself likes to point to and look at in his work. A guy named Apollonius of Ephesus, 3rd century person. Wow, what a character. I did some little research on this guy, quick research. If he was around today, he'd be a fortune teller, a psychic, maybe around the early 20th century. He'd work at the carnival. He was, a huckster, kind of a Elmer Gantry, a smart Benny Hinn type figure. He was a magician. He could really wow the crowds, and he could mesmerize and mystify communities. But in the 3rd century, in the town of Ephesus, which is a coastal town, I think, near the border of Greece and Turkey, there's a letter to the Ephesians in the New Testament. The Apostle Paul stopped there, and they said that they think that he wrote his letter to the Corinthians in Ephesus for what that's worth. But in the 3rd century, there was a pandemic going around the Roman Empire. Historians are not sure what the virus or the disease was like. Some speculate it might be something close to Ebola was going around at that time, and it hit Ephesus. And if you study what happens to a community psychologically when a pandemic strikes, and we don't have any familiarity or experience with that, and we don't know anything about how a community can lose its mind, right, when a virus starts to take hold. What happened to the United States was happening to Ephesus, but it was probably worse because we didn't have the modern science or virology to tell us how viruses were transmitted. What was the cause of everyone getting sick and dying, and people in the same household spreading this illness and sickness around? I mean, this can cause panic in a community, and it did. But Apollonius, this carnival huckster, comes through town one day, and if I get a volunteer, would someone be willing to read this? This is on the handout here. It's an excerpt of a writing that describes what Apollonius said and did in Ephesus in the middle of a pandemic. Yes, sir. If you wouldn't mind standing up too, that'd be great.
Take care, for I will today put a stop to the portion of the disease. With these words, Apollonius led the population to the theater. There he saw what seemed an old beggar, artfully blinking his eyes as if blind. He carried a wallet and a crust of bread. He was clad in rags and was really squalid countenance. Apollonius ranged the Ephesians around him and said, "Pick up as many stones as you can and hurl them at as enemy of the gods." Now the Ephesians wondered what he meant, and were shocked at the idea of murdering a stranger so manifestly miserable, for he was begging them to take mercy upon him. Nevertheless, Apollonius insisted and egged on the Ephesians to launch themselves on him and not let him go. And as soon as some of them began to take shots and hit him with their first stones, the beggar, who had seemed to blink, replied, giving them all a sudden glance, showed that his eyes were full of fire. Then the Ephesians recognized that he was a demon, and they stoned him so thoroughly that their stones were heaped to a great mound around him. After Apollonius bade them to remove the stones, they found that the beggar had disappeared, and instead of him, there was an owl. He flew inside to the largest lion. There he lay before their eyes, pounded to a pulp by their stones, and vomiting foam as mad dogs do. Accordingly, the statue of Hercules has been set up for the spot for the demon slain.
Thank you. That was a great reading. You shouldn't be reading scripture. You read scripture. Worship. Put them on the rotation. Next. Why is this interesting to Girard? It's interesting because he says he wants us to ask the question, what really happened here? What really happened here? If you were there that day, what would you have seen? And Girard says, what you would have seen that day is this carnival huckster coming into town, noticing that everyone is anxious, worried, upset. They don't know why everyone's getting sick. There's a lot of anxiety and tension. And here's an opportunist. He steps in and says, I can save the day for you. I know what's wrong with this community. Look at this guy with the cardboard sign underneath the interstate overpass. You think he's just a friendly neighborhood beggar, but that guy is, I think, a demon. And I think it's our duty to all gather stones, go under the underpass at the interstate, and let's throw stones at this old man for as hard and as long as we can until he's dead. And the community does it. This is what's so amazing. The community does it. They go under the underpass and stone this old homeless guy in Ephesus because they are just looking for answers. They are anxious. They don't want their children to die of the disease. They don't want their parents to die of the disease. They will do anything to fix the problem. And Apollonius knows it. And so he says, we're going to kill this guy. And in so doing, it's going to heal us. It will get rid of the disease, and all our anxiety and our tension will go away. And we can go back to the way we were before the pandemic. Religion has to come in and re-describe this horrible event that happened and say, look, he was not a human being. He was a demon. He was an animal. He was kind of a spawn of Satan type figure. And we know this because once we cleared away the rocks that we threw at him, it was not a human being that was there. It was a mad, foaming demon dog. And so that story now is this community's official story of what took place. No one is around any longer to say, you murdered an old homeless guy. No, the community, all the community remembers was one time there was a demon among us. And the Savior, Apollonius, identified him and got us to stone him to death. But it was okay because he was not a human being. He was not murder. It was an exorcism. And that makes it okay. This is a startling theory even now. Just imagine when it was in circulation in the 70s and 80s when Girard was writing. I mean, it turned the whole field of ancient religious mythological study on its head. Girard then says, I'm going to take a look at the founding text of the faith I left behind in France, the New Testament. And he said, I think I'm going to see a similar dynamic. I think I'm going to find in the New Testament the same old playbook. Because he remembers, right, from his catechism as a youth, oh, it's all about the sacrifice of Jesus. You know, Jesus goes to die so the community can live and be saved. It seems like it's going to fit the pattern that I've been seeing. But then he started to actually read the New Testament, and his jaw hit the floor. He could not believe what he was encountering. And the reason why our jaws do not often hit the floor when we read the New Testament is because we're so used to it. You know, if you go to church on a regular basis, it just sort of becomes like the furniture in your room. Oh, it's just there's Jesus, yeah, there's the cross. You go through the liturgical calendar every year, and it's just kind of the same old thing. And we cannot see the things that Gerard sees in it, who's seeing this through new eyes. And he's comparing what's going on in the New Testament with all these ancient myths that he's been studying. Because what is so fascinating to him about the New Testament is the murder is not covered up by myth. No one comes in to re-describe what happened to Jesus as something that had to happen. Jesus is not portrayed as a demon, as a figure who's a threat to the community. In the New Testament, he is the hero. He is the good guy. And he said, I've never seen a text that portrays the scapegoat as the hero, as the good guy, as someone who is innocent of the charges brought against him. The New Testament goes out of its way to say that this person was innocent, that he was railroaded, he was lynched. This guy was done wrong. And the New Testament doesn't cover it up. It puts it in our face. Look what this community did to this guy. It was terrible. If the New Testament operated according to the standard playbook, you know who would be the hero? The heroes of the New Testament? Caiaphas, Pilate, Judas, the Roman soldiers who nailed him to the cross. They would be the saviors, the heroes of the community, because they expelled the evil person from the community. They would be the heroes. Jesus would be the bad guy, like the Ephesian beggar in the 3rd century. But because it's all reversed, the story is told from the perspective of the scapegoat, not the scapegoaters. Everything now is turned on its head, and Gerard said, my God, what do I have before me? I don't have more mythology. He says, I have revelation before me. I have a disruptive, myth-busting text that's unique among all the other ancient religious texts in the world. There is something special about this book. And he started to argue this. The New Testament was a mold-breaking ancient story that was altogether different and unique from all the other stories of ancient cultures. If you notice closely, he is constructing an argument not for the superiority of Christianity or of Christians or of the church. He is constructing an argument for the superiority of the New Testament as a religious text. This text gives us windows onto reality that we cannot find anywhere else. And he looks back prior to, the beginning of Jesus' life and ministry, and Gerard says, I'm finding someone who's absolutely committed to the cause of non-violence. Jesus likes to quote his favorite passages from the Old Testament. I desire mercy and not sacrifice. Jesus is against sacrifice. He goes out of his way to ally himself with the kinds of people in his community that are most likely to be scapegoated. People who have physical disabilities. People, they say that these people in the New Testament are possessed by demons. Well, they're probably mentally ill. And Jesus takes their side. Women who are caught in the act of adultery, everyone's ready to stone them, and so they're able to put their virtues and their righteousness on display to convince everyone that they are good people. And Jesus says, stop what you're doing to this woman. It's wrong. He intercedes for her. And Gerard's, I can't believe this guy. I mean, you could not have made him up if you wanted to. I mean, the only way to explain this guy is if he really was who he says he was. Because no one else could have had the strength to function like he did in his day and time. Then you get to Jerusalem on Palm Sunday, and Gerard says, here is a community that's in crisis. I'm trying to look at my time. Why is Jerusalem in crisis? Israel is under a brutal occupation by the Roman Empire. If you are a part of a people who have you've lost your independence, you have lost your autonomy, you have lost the right to make your own decisions, and you live your life day to day, with someone's boot, a centurion's boot on your neck, this will throw you into crisis, especially if you're a community that understands itself as the community that holds the key to the salvation of the world, and you're God's chosen people. And you have the promise of Abraham on you, and you're thinking, what world is going on? Aren't we God's chosen people? And we're suffering under the persecution of the Roman Empire. The community in crisis starts to fracture. And this is what's fascinating. You can't really appreciate what's going on in the New Testament until you understand what's going on in first century Judaism. First century Judaism is fractured. It's in dissent. There's different camps being formed. We have, on the one hand, the Sadducees. They are the Jews who are trying to get in with the Roman occupiers. They are trying to integrate Judaism and Hellenism, or the Greek-Roman philosophy, mythology. They are the Jews that will serve on boards in Jerusalem because they are respectable Jews, because they are not the backward Jews. They're the Jews who are forward-looking because they're on board with Hellenism and Greek and Roman culture. Other Jews look at the Sadducees as the sellouts. Look, they're compromising the faith, trying to fit in with Roman society. You have a group of Jews called the Essenes, and they say, to hell with it all. We're going to go out into the desert and start the project Israel out there on our own, like monks in the desert, and we're just going to pray and write all day. And it's the Essenes who give us the Dead Sea Scrolls that we discovered later in the 20th century. They say the whole thing is compromised. Screw it. Let's go out to the desert and start anew. You have Pharisees who don't want to give up on Israel. They don't like the compromises being made by the Sadducees. They say, we can only control what we're able to control, and that is individual commitment to the law. So the Pharisees are the community organizers going out into the community, trying to get individuals to rededicate, recommit themselves to Mosaic law. They are the Jordan Petersons, Jordan Peterson of the first century, the Pharisees. And then you have the Zealots. The Zealots say, to hell with this, let's get a sword and stick it in the Roman centurions. Armed revolt, let's get rid of the oppressors. And none of these groups of Jews can agree on what the other should be doing or what the way forward for. It's fractured, it's split. And in the middle, you have the Jerusalem temple, Caiaphas, the religious leaders, and they've cut deals with the Roman Empire. They've cut deals with Herod. And they say, just leave us alone to keep the sacrifices in the temple going, to keep the worship of Yahweh in the temple going. Leave us alone to do that, and we will not side with zealots. We will not encourage armed insurrection by Jews against you. Just let our temples keep going the way they've always been going. You leave us alone, we'll let you alone. Well, no one liked the temple because they thought those guys had no backbone. Everyone hated the temple, no matter which group of Jews you were with. They were sellouts. So enter Jesus. He is not a Sadducee because he does not run in elite circles. He's not on the board of trustees. He's not appointed to, mayor's commissions. He's just some dude walking around ancient Galilee with 12 other people. They don't have any degrees or credentials to speak of. They are just trying to do their thing. But Jesus does not retreat out to the desert. He stays in contested territory. He's still trying to work with people. He's still trying to keep the project going. And in that respect, he's like a Pharisee insofar as he is doing individual outreach to people, but he doesn't like the Pharisees because the Pharisees are so damn moralistic. He says, you got to give people a break every now and then. This law sometimes is doing damage. This law that God gave us to make good things happen is sometimes making people's lives miserable. And sometimes you have to be compassionate and merciful towards people and give people a break. Well, the Pharisees don't like this. You know, and Jesus doesn't even appear on the radar screens of many Sadducees. He's just so down here and so low. He goes into Jerusalem with all this tension, all this rivalry. And Jerusalem is on edge. And it's on edge because the Roman Empire is worried that with the influx of people that come in every year for the Passover, there might be zealots in the crowd. And maybe the zealots are going to try something during the Passover and start an armed insurrection. And what does Jesus do? He doesn't exactly try to lower the temperature because he comes riding in on a donkey. And some biblical scholars have said he is mocking Caesar when he comes into Jerusalem on a donkey, because that's the Caesar came into Jerusalem with his chariots and his big show and his display of might and power. And Jesus comes in humbly walking in on a donkey. And some say he's saying to everybody, Caesar is a jackass. I'm riding in on a jackass. Caesar is a jackass. So he's making a political point, some people say, by coming into Jerusalem as he does. Jesus then goes to the temple and he doesn't say, let's work this out. No, he gets so mad at all the junk going on in the temple that he turns the tables over, causes a big disruption, and there he gets on the radar screen of the temple leaders. This guy is going to cause trouble. We cut deals with the Roman Empire. He came in here during Passover, caused a big disturbance, and he's going to ruin the deal that we set up with the Roman Empire. Rome is on edge. Jews are on edge. The temple is on edge. Rivalry begins to build, and Gerard says, what's going to happen? Someone has to have all this collective wrath visited upon them to heal the community, to bring them together. And this is the story of Good Friday. The community turns on this guy. He's not an elected politician. He doesn't have an army. He doesn't have theological educational credentials. He's just some guy from from the sticks. He comes in and perfect candidate for a scapegoat that will cleanse the city of Jerusalem of all its tension. And that's essentially what it does. And Gerard couldn't believe it when he looks at the fourth gospel, and Caiaphas, the high priest himself, articulates 20 centuries prior Gerard's theory. Because in this handout here, I duplicated it here for you. Caiaphas' colleagues are saying, what are we going to do with this Jesus guy? He's messed everything up. Right? Rome is going to come in here and destroy our temple and our nation. But Caiaphas, who was appointed high priest that year, he said, relax, guys. Take it easy. You guys don't know how this works. This isn't my first rodeo. I know how to bring a community together and heal crisis. It is better for you to have one man die for the people than to have the whole nation destroyed. And Gerard couldn't believe it. Here is Caiaphas articulating how scapegoating works. He knows the playbook, and he's getting ready to operationalize the playbook against Jesus. And another thing that strikes Gerard is Herod and Pilate. You know, the Trump and DeSantis of their day. They are supposed to be on the same side, but they both have big egos and they're elbowing each other for the prize. And these rivals, in Luke it says, they used to be enemies, they used to be rivals, but the day they both turned their focus on Jesus to go get Jesus, Luke says these guys became friends with one another, united by their common opposition to the scapegoat. Well, the mob doesn't help things either, because the mob is just caught up in this frenzied need to dump their energy on someone. And Pilate says, well, who do you want? Do you want Barabbas? And they, no, we want Jesus, Jesus, crucify him, crucify him. And right there, law and order goes out the door. The judicial process falls apart. Pilate is supposed to be the responsible political leader, washes his hands of the whole situation, walks away from the authority of his office, said, you want this guy? Take it, you have it. And maybe when this guy's gone, we can all get back to normal and stop the craziness of this weekend. And Jesus on the cross later says, Father, forgive them, for they do not know what they are doing. And Girard interprets this as these people are caught up in the scapegoat mechanism, in mimetic rivalry, and they've lost their minds. And it's not their fault because they are doing what human beings have always done from the beginning. Find someone to blame and dump their resentment on, and they think that this is the way the community can be saved. And Jesus says, I know them. I know how they think. They know how they operate. They are being possessed by social forces that they don't understand. Do not hold it against them, says Jesus. What is further amazing about this text, I'm going to conclude and get to worship, is that in this text, the scapegoat does not stay dead. He does not stay buried under the pile of rocks like the Ephesian beggar under the underpass. He is raised to new life by God, and when he is raised, he bears the wounds and the scars of scapegoating, so that there is no one can make an attempt to cover up what had happened. You did this to me. This was what you did to try to save yourselves. And the wounds are here on the resurrected body so that this can never be covered up by any religion or religious figure or religious text. The wounds will stay on my body for eternity. But guess what? I haven't come to seek revenge. I haven't come to wage war on you. I forgive you. And let's start anew. Let's start afresh. Let's start to build a new kind of community that doesn't have to organize and unify itself around scapegoating. Because when I go away, the Holy Spirit will be given to this community. And you will find a new way to navigate life together by way of it. Thank you very much.